So we are here. It's 7:06. We should get started. We're going to talk about the wood shop and sort of projects that go along with it. And then we're going to do a brief show and tell. This is we're sort of warming up to show and tell this week because a lot of you have probably gotten badges. And so just about everybody will say, oh, I got a bandsaw badge with a few exceptions. So we're gonna talk about lessons. We got some examples of joinery and other weird things up here. And let's do it. Okay. So we're going to talk about wood shop projects. Get the cursor on the right thing. Great. And so we start off again just talking about the badging process. So if you have, for any logistical reason, it's not a problem, whatever. The getting the badges process again, find your badge on the website, makehaven.org/all-badges. Or you can go look at equipment, and then this will take you off finally to load to all of the different badges that you can get. And if you want, I think you can look out. Oh, you can even search by thing, like if you need an in-person checkout or after successful quiz, or other things, you can get badges a lot of different ways. But in here, you can just sort of search for woodshop ones or find whichever one you want to use. That's the process. Lots of you have been doing that already, which is great. Yes, if I go to MakeHaven, somewhere it's in here, makehaven.org. Do you know what the slash is? User? Member? My membership?
My profile and badges.
That's the one. Okay, so my profile and badges are, I got a bunch of badges. I am not the leader, but look at that list. And then I got some in pending.
You can look at your own badges. You can also see other people's badges on their user profile page.
Ooh.
You can also see the ranking of who has the most badges.
That's true. Community badge earning
after title.
It is. For 2 years in a row, I had it. And then I gave away my secret, which is just get all of them in December. Because January 1st is when they count. So Aaron right now is the leader at 104. And then Bob, and am I still I'm number 3. Yeah. All right. And then once you get, I think, past down here, we have a lot of people that were, well, it used to be a bunch of people that were all foundation students. And now this has really changed around. Lila did foundations. She's also does the tufting thing. So this is Adam. Ooh, look at you, 46. That's pretty great. Very respectable. So eventually you get more and more badges. You can turn on all sorts of, here's Vincent at 39. So there's a whole bunch of badges that you can get. You do, by no means do you need to do the insane list that Adam or the Aaron and Adam and I have. But it's kind of fun. Some people really like this. They will call you out at the annual meeting to say, great job, top leaderboard. And I think they're thinking about doing like most improved and all of that. So which is, it's a fun metric. But in here, that is not the point of what we're talking about, but get your badges, go through this, schedule time with a facilitator. I'm standing right in front of the facilitator schedule board, and you can message these people on Slack. You've probably met with some already. They're very, very helpful, delightful people. The wood shop has got a lot of facilitators, which is really excellent. And so you can work with them to try and get all those things going. This week, we're going to start, last week, we talked a lot about the tools. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more high level about projects and those sorts of plans that you could make, things that you could go after. And so we're going to look at lots of examples. Like here's that floating wine holder, or here's some hairpin legs. I bought 4 sets of hairpin legs on Amazon a couple of months ago because it's really easy to just get a slab of wood and then screw some of these onto the bottom and boom, side table, done. Coffee table, complete. It's really nice. And buying a slab of wood and then just finishing it, sanding it smooth, making it look nice. You can do a really good job with a fairly low effort task. I've got a cookie cut of a sassafras tree that I'm gonna make into a side table. It's pretty fun at home. You need to epoxy it together. But these are all sorts of different projects that you could take on. Any other examples for starter projects? Looking at this list, Adam, things that jump to mind of stuff that would be good.
Both kind of like that badge, a couple people on lake, basically. There's
A little louder. You gotta.
Yeah. So it's a great starter project, and you can do that out of green wood. It doesn't need to be dry wood. Um, and and Megan found an awesome one, very similar to like a bandsaw box for the bracelet. Instead, I posted the video on Slack and shows how to do that.
And Puma had a really cool scoops exercise, where there's some scoops that she made, and so they were a lot of fun.
Similar. The bandsaw is the only tool.
Yep. So there's some cool ones out there. So we're going to take a look in a little bit more detail at these and sort of the process you go through to get from an idea to a thing when you're thinking about all of these different pieces. Let's see, something in the chat. Cool. Then next up. So really, we're going to try and break this down to 5 steps just to sort of structure what's going to happen in the slides and how you might think about it. There is no real universe where it has to go in this order if you're doing a project. It's just some structure for us to work on. And so we start off with planning or designing. And so with that, you can plan and design in a whole lot of ways. And we've got some that are pulled up. There's a lot of different ways that people think about the world. And this is going to give us different processes to consider. So planning, there's like the high level planning, like what do you need or what do you want? Do you want a coffee table? What are the constraints? Like, are you going to buy the finest imported zebra wood? Are you going to get the deepest Amazon rainforest sapele? Are you going to get some crazy like exotic thing? Or are you just going to like, what? I need this to work for $12 and one big 12 by or 2 by 6. Like those sorts of things you can totally work with. And then how do you want to plan it out? What do you want it to look like? There's various levels, and we'll sort of explore what those look like as you're imagining and designing project solutions. And for a lot of people, the thing that we don't have on the slide is just Googling an example project. I think most of the people who had a project that happened this week found some inspiration on the internet. And so we're going to be talking about that just as much. A big thing that we'll come back to again and again, and this is me as a high school engineering teacher, is a design cycle. It's really good to think about projects that you have in a sort of iterative process, especially if you have something that's quick and processable. Puma and I both played around with the scoops, and I made this little tiny like spoiled celery one first to see what the process was like. And then we both made our second ones. I feel like it came out a lot better. Yeah. Doing this where you have like an idea, a question to start with, then you make some, and then you have new ideas that come about from there. You build a solution, you evaluate it. You can go through a cycle so that things increasingly get better. If you do that, this is actually, I think this originated in the military, where you start off your first time through this cycle. Your question, ideas, building solutions, and evaluating should lead you to a minimum viable product. That little spoiled celery scoop, fundamentally, it's a scoop. Is it a scoop I want to use for everything or like eat cereal with? No, but it exists. It's a thing. And from that process, we learned a lot, right? We learned which bandsaw blades were sharp and dull. We learned what was going on for the actual shaping of the things, whether you should cut out the scoop inside or the outsides first. We thought about a lot of those pieces in processing the design, and it's really, really helpful. But also the reason why you can go through the design cycle and why if it's possible to do it multiple times, it is very helpful. It's because you get a more concrete idea about what it is you're going to do. And the more you can really wrap your head around it, the better you're going to be able to figure out a solution. And so that's really what all of these next few slides are going to be about, is trying to build that up. Some people really do well with this. Did you ever do any isometric drawings?
I actually haven't. And my drawing has always been very napkin sketchy.
All right, cool. This is one that, like, if you are a teacher in the Project Lead the Way pipeline, which maybe is a thing you know about, maybe is not. This is a thing that we actively teach high schoolers right now. Across the country, there's a whole freshman course designed around teaching kids this. even though there are computers to design on. I am baffled as to why that's still a thing. But it is because it's an old school way to do design work, and some people really like it. These are very just like an image that you could build from. The 60-degree angles here on all these triangles make it sort of helpful to imagine in 3 dimensions, but it's not super, super great. Another thing for a lot of projects, you might have a simple template. The Family Handyman was a magazine that my father-in-law thought would be perfect for me. So he got me a 2-year subscription. And every issue, they would send out a set of templates like this, where they're like, here's your cut list. Get a sheet of plywood and cut it like this and like this and like this. And you can build some weird thing that you didn't need. But it was really nicely laid out as a flat design, would tell you exactly where and how to cut it. And if you just cut those pieces, they would assure you you'd have a magical, beautiful secretary desk. I don't know if that ever sure worked for somebody. It must have been good in some contexts, but this is some people really, their brains work this way, or they have these really cool like historical drawings of how to make stuff that come in this fashion. So there's some really cool ways that you can design like this. It's also fundamentally 2-dimensional, which is really cool in that you can draw it on a sheet of paper, right? If you have a piece of wood and a Sharpie, you can just draw out where you want to cut on a big flat piece of wood and boom, there you go. I would say this is better in my mind than the isometric because you get a sense of exactly where you need to cut instead of sort of representing that. But then it brings us into 3D CAD models. This is where my headspace starts to work. I like to think in 3D as much as humanly possible. It just works. That's how my brain works. Do you do much 3D modeling, Adam?
I do. I have Fusion has been a big tool of mine. And I've sort of started transitioning into, I've done some projects where design top to bottom in Fusion, and generate cut lists, which we'll talk about in a minute, based on what you design there. And I've kind of, as I've gotten more comfortable with woodworking, gotten more experience, I'll start just throwing all different views of a drawing or different views of a model onto a piece with dimensions, and then just go to the shop and I can figure out what I need from that. So it allows for a lot of flexibility with workflows, which is awesome.
Cool. Yeah. I very much appreciate that. The baby lock just shut off. The little sewing machine. All right. So in addition to this slide that just sort of shows 3D CAD models, I figured it would be fun to actually have some up and running. Like this is an overview of the Wacom stand, which I designed and built last spring as an example when we were going through CNC stuff. And so this was the 3D model of that tablet that's over there by the couches on the far side of the main room. And so I designed it in here. And actually I designed it in Fusion 360, where I am very much comfortable. This is everybody, or later on, we're going to talk about 3D design software. There's a week or two that's ascribed to this specific skill. So we'll get better with this with practice. And this is pretty advanced use of Fusion 360, I would say, because not only did I design it like this, where each one of the pieces is there, and I can like turn off the, if I can see it and it's not too small, I can turn off the top surface and sort of see what's going on underneath there. But also I can turn that back on and switch over from design to manufacture. And it takes all of those pieces. And like Adam was saying, in a digital design software, it's not a free service, but I have an education license. It's going to take all of these pieces and lay them out so that we can see what it looks like when it's flat. That whole tablet was cut out of one sheet of plywood, and here's the plan for that. It was all laid out just like this. So that fit onto one sheet of plywood. These are a bunch of test cuts that I also was able to jam in there. But all of these pieces, the test cuts let me know exactly how much tolerance and other things I had to play in, but this is a skill that we can get to. For me, it was very helpful to do this so I could really wrap my head around it and think about it a lot. This will not be your first Fusion 360 project to do this. I just want to say that out loud. But as you get better and better, it can be very helpful to take a design and move that way. A little more simple plan is here's this quick work table. This is a table that I made that's a significantly simpler design. It's a top and a few legs. And I have it over here. This also came out of one sheet of plywood where you can sort of see, we're going to look towards joinery. There's some joinery holding the legs together and attaching them to the top, some bolts to hold them in. Planning out a model like this can be really, really helpful. And it's totally a skill you can build towards. What's up? Yeah, both of these two examples that I just pulled up, they were made on a CNC machine. It doesn't have to be done that way, but I'm comfortable doing that. So I like doing the CNC machine, and feeding that 3D information into a CNC machine is basically required.
How long?
For the table, I think it was 3 hours total cutting time, and half of it was the Made at MakeHaven logo on the side. Just because it's a lot of detail and it's got a lot of things to do. If I had just nixed that and just made a stand, it would have been an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes. There's also a video somewhere of that happening, so you can watch it in time lapse if you want. And I can share that in Slack if you feel like it. But that is, CAD is a good way to do this. There's also other ways to make things in CAD. We're going to go through lots of different models, but really wrapping your head around something can be really important for a project. Which brings us to prep work. Once you have a plan, once you have an idea, the next most important thing is to really get prepped for it. And this is all about getting things ready, getting them square, doing the joiner and the planer work. And this one, I think, gets a lot of people. I was just having a conversation on Slack about the trickiness, the intimidatingness of going to a lumber yard and like asking like, what do I buy? Where do I go? What are the questions I even need to ask at a lumber yard? Do you remember your first time to a lumber yard, Adam?
I actually don't. Was fairly recent, but there can be definitely intimidating. People seem like they know exactly what they need to know all around you, and you don't. They don't know much more than you. I will say that flat out. Period. And there's just a couple kind of keywords that you can wrap your head around, and you will know how to buy lumber like a pro.
Yeah, you start Googling board feet.
Board feet is a big one.
Yep, it's how you know if you're being ripped off. There's a certain price per board feet, and which is like the actual volume of the piece of wood. So you pay by volume, but it's called board feet instead of volume for silly reasons. Imperial system reasons, probably, instead of like centimeters cubed, which would make a whole lot more sense.
And thinking about the dimensions of the thing that you are buying, it's really easy to look at two boards and say, why is that one twice as much as that one? They look basically the same, but every quarter inch of thickness in a board is a significant amount more material that you're buying. If you're buying so you talked about quarters for board thickness. So 6 quarters is literally about 1.5 inches thick, and 4 quarters is 1 inch. 6 quarters is half again as much material as 4 quarters. So it's going to be significantly more wood, significantly more expensive most of the time. And in a lumber yard, thicker pieces are rarer, so they will actually be more expensive still than just the unit cost of the volume of material.
So like the really thick tabletops, they're super expensive because those boards are rare. They're harder to get, they're harder to find. To find good ones that don't have a bunch of like crappy things going on inside, it's just going to cost a lot. And then if you're buying like at the end of this, we'll see an example table, but like you can pay very high dollar for a fancy solid wood table for a dining room table sort of thing. But once you've got a piece of wood, purchasing those materials, letting the wood acclimate, these are all problems that we'll talk about solving. And then squaring wood. You may have done some of that. If you got the joiner or the planer badge, those are squaring wood. That's that process. templates and jigs, and then getting things ready. It all very much helps. If you're going to work in our shared workspace, which we all are, that's why we're here, there's a few things that are good to do. As prep work before you get started with something, like checking that the joiner fence is 90 degrees. That one I've never really seen not be 90 degrees. But like this week, I tilted the bandsaw table, and if I had forgotten to tilt it back, it might have been like a degree or two out of square. So checking things like that, check the table saw blade, make sure that it's square if you want it to be.
The catch-all is don't assume things are left the way you would hope they would be left.
Right.
So double check everything.
Not out of any malintent, just, people forget and they walk away. So
The flip side of that is leave things as you would hope they would be left. So it's a little quicker for the next person.
yep, absolutely. And then clean up after yourself, report broken equipment. Another thing, and this is important, check to see if the tool is there before you assume that you're like gonna head down a path where you need it in 40 minutes. Like check to make sure that it's in the space if you see it coming. Any other thoughts or ideas for stuff in a shared workshop other than this list? What do you think? Oh, yes, you can do that. If Leor's around, you can talk to Leor, or Adam's getting a list. There's a list. There's also a sign where you can say I'm broken. Here you go. Out of order.
These are right on the left when you go into the wood shop. So if something breaks, the first step, put this on it. Second step, throw it up on Slack.
And
Lefty.
yeah, it's really helpful. And so those little signs are just inside the wood shop. Let's see. Another thing that's really good to do that may be a part of your prep work is coming up with a template. If you've watched a lot of like YouTube woodworkers will sell templates to the projects that they do on YouTube, where they'll cut it on a CNC and ship it to you to make the projects a little bit easier. But templates like this can be really helpful. This is a templating bit with a profile on it. Some router bits have bearings like this, and those bearings let them ride along the edge of something like a template. So if you wanted to make a piece of wood where you wanted this little cut profile to go into it, but you wanted it to follow a template, a bearing like this one can be really helpful. It will let these bits follow along, whereas this bit doesn't have a bearing on top of it, so it can't like follow something. If you just try to push your piece into that router bit, it'll just keep on going. The bearing here is not a cutting surface, so it'll just ride right along. And as the router bit spins, it'll trace out the pattern that you want. If you're really careful, you can make your templates out of something that's like much easier to shape, like MDF. If you're going to make an oak table, oak is a very hard material. Sanding it will take a while, but MDF, a little sandpaper, you can adjust the shape of something really easily. So if you're sort of router table centric, this can be a great way to use something to make things that are sort of complicated shapes, and works really nicely.
You can use a template. You can use maybe 1/2-inch MDF, and you can use that template to shape your inch-thick tabletop using a bearing bit. So there's a lot more flexibility to your shape that you have.
Or if you want to do like 4 identical table legs, you can use a template, make the shape, pop it off, put it on the next leg, and like go from one to the next to the next. They can be really great for trying to make identical pieces. Oh, medium density fiberboard. And do you think you can find some? It's like, so we talked about plywood and we talked about OSB, which looks like scraps of wood all glued together. MDF is a big old sheet of what looks like sawdust. That's just all one big mass. And that's basically all it is. I think he's going to find some. There's definitely some in there. If you walk in and look at the Gerber, the top surface of it is MDF. It doesn't have a perceivable grain structure. It just looks like cardboard, but turned into a piece of wood. And let me Google it really fast so I can show you what it looks like. MDF Lowe's. It just looks like the most nondescript thing you've ever seen. It's just like a rectangle of brown. That's it. No detail. Yep, there it is. Zoom in. Ah, look at that. More different brown. That's all it is. And it comes in different sizes. This is 58 for what's the thickness, 3/4 inch, full sheet of that. If you wanted to do different thicknesses, there's different sizes. Here's a 1/2 inch MDF with a project panel. So this is 2 foot by 4 foot, $20. Generally, MDF is cheaper than wood. We didn't find any, or do we find some?
No,
Okay, all right, that's fine.
they just took the trash out.
Oh, that's true. They did just take the trash out. Okay. So back to this. In addition to templates, jigs are another great thing to think about. A jig is something like this. We talked about sleds for the table saw and jigs for the table saw. They can help you make different and complicated cuts. In this case, you've got, it looks like sort of an angle piece here and then a little end stop, and there's the table saw. It looks to me like this would be for cutting 45-degree angles onto a sort of long, skinny piece of wood. But these are things that you can usually throw together pretty quickly, and they can help you make repeatable cuts or cuts that otherwise would be really difficult to make. And so if you're finding and following plans, they may tell you to quickly make a jig. And I'll put a Past Makes video where he does kumiko, which is like a Japanese like screen structure. It's really cool, but it's made out of really tiny pieces of wood, all made with a chisel and some jigs. So it's a cool process. It looks like a little meditative to do, actually. But that's prep work. So things that you would do before it's actually time to make the project. Then comes the cutting, which is what most people think of when they think of the wood shop projects, is like the actual cutting of the wood. This is where like, it's happening. This is the event. And so this is really something that can happen a lot of different ways. But in general, it's follow your cut list if you have one. And if you don't, you're sort of making it up on the fly. That can be a great way to make things on the lathe. Usually you may cut things just sort of wildly, but following a cut list is good to have.
It can be a good way to make things, and it can also be a good way to make things you didn't intend to make, and take longer to make things than you intended to. If you don't have a cut list to follow.
Yeah, having a cut list is really, really helpful. And you can usually make those on your own. Another thing to think about that as you're cutting is a little bit about where you cut the board from, like what part of the wood does it come from? And we talked about this a bit, last week. Where the piece of wood comes from in the log will have an impact on how it behaves over its lifetime. Like these right out of the middle of the piece of wood, these are called quarter sawn, and you can see the darker areas are how they'll sort of stretch and change over the course of a year. So if you cut a fully saturated tree in like a not completely dry tree, and then its moisture content decreases, this is how they're likely to change. The quarter sawn ones will get a little bit thinner, but in a reliable, predictable way. A round like a dowel will get a little oblong. It won't be quite cylindrical. Cut this way, they do the same, but sort of perpendicular. These give sort of a cupping structure, which can be frustrating. And you go through that way. There's different names for how these may twist or cup, like twisting, cupping, a crook, and a bow. Those are all different ways that you can describe your boards. And if you want a masterclass in what these boards look like, go to Home Depot and just look through their 2x4s, right? They've actually started to add a new section in those big box stores of like select 2x4s, which are the less bent ones, because they've been like laughably bent forever. But when you're building, yeah.
You look at this straight, by the time you shop, they're sort of like stitch or straight.
Yeah, it's wild. Another thing that's good to think about is the seasonal wood movement. Is that over the course of a year, you totally expect movement in a piece of wood. And it's different in different dimensions. Like along the grain like this, longitudinally, almost no change at all whatsoever. It stays basically in exactly the same. Radially 4%. And so that's sort of from the inside to the outside, a 4% change. But tangentially, it's 8%, which is, if you're looking at the quarter sawn in this, it may make sense why they drew it that way. Most of your movement is tangential to the circle of the tree rings, if you're into that math geometry terminology. For that reason, if you're making a dining room table, best practice is to flip-flop the grain curve on each board. So if you get to that point where you're building a table on your own, making it so they look sort of wavy on the end is preferred, because it'll make a washboard effect as it dries. If they're all the same way, you get sort of this problematic curve arch that comes as the whole thing dries together, and each of them sort of multiply. If they're alternating, they cancel each other out, and you get sort of a wave across the top that will be almost imperceptible. But this is something that none of you should think about this week. Seasonal wood movement is for like a super advanced user who's really doing something that's magical, and they're selling each piece for $10,000. If you're not doing that, and nobody is this week, probably, I'm assuming, don't worry about the seasonal wood movement. It's a good advanced thing, but everybody loves to talk about it because it makes you sound like the smartest woodworker in the world, right?
Piece, like, they don't have that much more than you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, even an 8% change is like, if you're making a small piece, that's nothing. Like if your piece is 4 inches, 5-6 inches wide, 8% difference is not going to be noticeable for a long time. Let's see. For good cuts, if you're trying to make good cuts, there's a handful of different pieces of advice. This is one that I think about a lot. If you're doing a pull saw or a hand saw, especially if it's solid, you want the reflection in your saw to look square and perpendicular. That is probably the best trick that I've got. So you can, if you're looking at this picture and you see, that's Jonathan Katz-Moses from YouTube, a screenshot of him, that board that he's cutting, the reflection in the saw right over here looks like it's completely in line with the whole piece of wood. It's just reflecting, like it's acting like a mirror, but that's letting him know that he's cutting at 90 degrees. If it was off angle, it would look like in the saw was tipping up or tipping down. It's the best trick to accurately, in the moment, tell if you're going straight. Any other good tips?
Everybody that has the first cut, second cut, that is an awesome tip for if you have the table saw. You can sneaking up on dimensions and cutting to fit non-measurements is great advice. If you're trying to fit a piece into another piece, you're always going to cut it a little bit too long to then work up to reaching that cut. When you are using a hand saw, get it close to your line, plus the time anyway. So it's a similar approach, but you'll connect with a different tool.
Yeah, I was thinking about the first cut, second cut when I was reflecting on Kate's project, which will be a fun show and tell later, and thinking we probably should have cut that first circle in and then like sanded our way out. The sanding would have been painful, but it would have been the smart move. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, sounds great. Used skateboards have got to be cheap. Yeah, absolutely. All right, and then there's some pull saw tips and router tips for that. So you've cut all your things. You use the best possible techniques. First cut, second cut. Made sure your saw was straight. Maybe use a CNC to do the cutting if that's your jam. And now you're going to try and fasten these things together. There's permanent attachments, some essential joinery types, and we have a few here as examples. Removable attachments, planning for wood movement, other types of hardware, and then mixed other things. So first up, let's talk about joinery. Joinery comes in many different fashions. This is another way that you can prove your awesomeness to other woodworkers, is by mastering different types of joinery. A miter joint is a common one that is used all over the place in trim. In a house, you'll use miter joints for outside corners, or on picture frames, you'll cut them with a miter joint, or door trim has miter joints. Those are where you cut a 45-degree angle and then put things together. The half lap is one of the great strong joints that are out there in the world. where you take half of the piece of wood and you cut it away. And this is a lot stronger than a butt joint because you have this sort of overlapping side grain to side grain area. And these can be directly in line like they're shown here. Or this one, you could actually rotate the top piece 90 degrees and it works great. This top half lap splice is also super easy to make. It's just a cup. It's like 1 or 2 extra cuts when you're putting things together. And it adds a lot of strength for not a whole lot of effort, which is really good. There's also box joints. So these sort of have these connections here. I'm trying to see, maybe I think I have some near the surface for this. Edge to edge and butt joints. The finger joint is what I called it here. So here's another example. And if I take one of these and I move not the face, I want to move the body of this thing away. If I grab this thing and sort of move it out of place, you can see they have fingers that mesh into each other. So these fingers go into those grooves and these fingers go into those grooves. And this is a lot like a lap joint. They just sort of mesh together in a useful way. These are not necessarily easy to do, but they're easy to make on many different types of processes. What's up? That's a great question. And it's different for each different type of tool to make the tolerances work. Doing it by hand, it's a lot of magical practice and process. Yeah. There's jigs for a table saw to make it work and make it consistent and beautiful if you're doing it with a table saw. You can also use these on the laser cutter. And then if you use the right thing on the laser, it'll plan that out for you. In the Wacom stand, I had a few of these, and there I planned it out with a CNC, and I just needed to know like how much is the bit that's going to cut things wobble around. And so you can design in for tolerances, but really it's all about each process. It's a little bit different. My instinct with a finger joint is they've basically always been strong enough that glue is fine. If you've got the rule of thumb I have in my head is a drywall screw. This is probably not relevant to fine woodworking, but a drywall screw, like if you can hit a stud in your wall and you want to hang a picture on it, a normal like 2.5 inch screw is 200 pounds guaranteed. So it's a whole lot of force that you get when you add a screw. A nail is a little bit different, but wood glue, like we said, is stronger than the wood. So if you've got this sort of a joint, the fingers are almost there for alignment and like glue area to connect. And then it's stronger than the wood where you actually connect them. Then this joint that Adam is holding is, and we can probably put it up in front of the camera real close just for a second. So it makes it there. That's a dovetail joint. On the nicest drawers, the ones that you've seen, and we can probably just pass it around a bit. These are like the premium drawers. When you're paying for the highest quality Amish made solid wood furniture, they probably have dovetail joints. And those, in addition to the glue that holds them together, they have a mechanical like lockingness in the way that they're built. So once they're put together and there's glue there, that those two pieces are going to be very difficult to get apart. And that's probably still stronger than a nail, or as strong as a nail, maybe. Sharing my screen again, just making sure we're on target. And so we've got these things to take a look at, but those I would put into the box joint and the half lap joint. The dovetail is probably somewhere in this family if we would have included it. And then a rabbet joint. These are really common for putting the backs on a cabinet, or like where you put the glass in a picture frame is a rabbet joint, where it's set a little bit on the frame. Rabbet joints are really great for a lot of panels to put in. There's a lot of the things. I was reflecting on this a little bit this week. A lot of the older processes, and woodworking, I'd say, is an older process that we're going to cover in the course. The older the process, the more random, weird terms it has. And so woodworking, being very, very old, has a whole lot of weird terms like dado and rabbet spelled wrong and half lap and all those things. Whereas when you get to CNC machining, it's a little bit more straightforward in its English language. So that's nice. Cool. But let's say you want to modify those joints. If you realize like, oh, this needs to be stronger and I want to add a nail or I want to add something. These are basically all ways that in my mind, you can modify one of those joints to make them stronger than they would have been without them. You can add splines, which is what these are. A lot of picture frames, if you walk down the hallway to the storage in the back, there are splines on the corner of those picture frames. A miter joint is pretty strong, but it's not super duper strong. So you can cut splines like these and add in another piece of wood. It gives you more wood surface that's side grain to side grain that glues that up and makes the corners much, much stronger. Ruby is a big fan of putting splines in all her picture frames. I think she actually made those picture frames on the way to the back room. And so she's a big fan of doing splines in picture frames. You can also embed dowels into things. Those can be great for registering location, especially in like a butt joint or just adding some strength. Dominoes, this machine right here is the domino joiner, and it is a special type of joinery. It's a super swanky German-made tool. It's very, very strong. It's for alignment and added strength, which is really nice. Biscuits are basically the same thing. We have a biscuit joiner also. Biscuits aren't so much for strength, they're more for alignment. Lila, for her final project, made a shoe putting on station for like by the door, a bench. Wow, I lost the word bench. Sorry guys. And she used biscuits in that to align all of the pieces so they wouldn't move around while she was trying to glue it up. You can also do angles or bow ties. Some people I really do like the look of a bow tie. It looks like a bow tie in a piece of wood. Those are there usually so that a crack in a natural piece of wood doesn't come apart any further, because as the crack might try to grow, it pulls on the bow tie sort of like a dovetail, and it resists that opening. So it's another good trick. It's a neat way to make things stronger. These are all ways that you can modify the previous types of joinery. So if you wanted to add dowels to a butt joint, or you wanted to add dominoes or splines to a miter, you can totally make those additions and alterations, and you'll get stronger and better joinery styles as you go through these. Also, there's even more. These are other ways that you can fix things. You can do it permanently with wood glue, dowels, nails. These are pocket hole screws. People have strong opinions about pocket hole screws. I think they're great because they help. Other people think they look ugly and should be avoided at all costs. And I don't know what's wrong with those people. They're very simple and easy to do. I say go for it. They're screws that come in on an angle. There's a specific jig that helps you do it. It's probably blue. Are you going to grab it? I'm going to grab it. That sounds great. Thank you. And that pocket hole jig makes it very easy to add screws in. And as long as they're like on the inside of a cabinet, the inside or the outside of a drawer, you'll never ever see them. And so just go for it with wild abandon. You can hide them and they'll stay well out of view, but make things much stronger. There's also different removable ways that you can join things. These are famous at IKEA. They're all over the place in IKEA furniture. They're very helpful for putting things together and taking them apart. A little stud like this with some threads in it, and then a furniture screw like that works great. Just some bolts and threaded inserts. Oh, here's the, yeah, oh yeah, great. This is the pocket hole, the Craig pocket hole jig, where you take your piece of wood, you stick it in here, slap it into place, and then you use a drill to just drill right down through these holes, and you put a perfect little spot to through that in. The wood straight, it's very simple. It's easy to wrap your head around when you're designing. Would recommend it 10 out of 10. Another process that you can use is to take something like this, the screw, and sink in this little brass piece that I'm trying to unscrew from. This little brass piece you can permanently affix into a piece of wood. Because wood with fasteners, you're not always meant to come in and out a bunch of times, but you can sink in one of these, one of these, and then a screw can come in and out of that piece of wood a whole lot of times. There's also T-nuts you may have seen that are sort of spiritually the same as this, just bigger, pointier, but little things like this can be really helpful. And there's all sorts of different options that are fun to do. Figure 8 fasteners. These, we tried to see if there were any in the back. These are just like funny looking double washers, but you can see this side's beveled and that one's actually beveled on the other side. The figure 8 fasteners are really good to attach a tabletop to a frame, because if the tabletop is one big piece that may grow and shrink by 8%, these will sort of swivel, these can swivel and allow for that movement without things breaking. If you take a table and glue it directly to its frame, eventually the growth and shrinking of that tabletop may crack its connection to the frame. If you attach it with some of these, it'll be able to move and wiggle around. I'll send out a 4 Eyes Furniture video this week where they definitely show these things and how they work. They're very helpful, but again, probably don't try and make a dining room table this week. The general piece of advice. You can also just have things that fit together, like the Wacom table has no screws in it. And it's not glued. They just fit together. So if you get to a point, you can totally make that work. So its tolerances are I have 4 screws in it, and they're to keep the shelf up. There's like a keyboard drawer. It's to keep the keyboard drawer from falling down because there's nothing beneath it. And that's it. Those are all the screws.
That was the test pieces at the end of your plywood sheet.
Right. The test pieces let me get exactly to the right fit so that everything just fit together. I didn't have to add in any wood glue, which is really nice. Here's an example of other ways you can build things. This is a beautiful table made out of one of those very rare pieces of wood, like we're talking about. Some very nice grain. There's some epoxy going on in there, high-end legs. This table in 2020, right at the end, the very start of the pandemic, October 2020, was $9 grand, 10 grand. That's a lot. I'm sure it would cost more now because so does everything, even cucumbers that we all love. And so making things like this are really cool, but also they are really expensive. Mixing media is great. Epoxy with wood is a great time. I would strongly encourage it. If you're curious about it, we'll play with epoxy a lot more. But epoxy is very machinable in that it works just about the same as a piece of wood. It's just about as easy to use on a table saw. Epoxy, just about as easy on the lathe. It's a little different. If you use wood on the lathe, sawdust and chips will come off. If you use epoxy on the lathe, weird stringy noodles will come off. But otherwise, it's about the same amount of force. It feels kind of the same. It's the same amount of burden to the saw. And so it's a really good way to put things together. For that sassafras cookie that I'm going to turn into a side table, I'm going to put it together with epoxy because that way, if I need to cut into it, I totally can. If I put it together with screws, then I'd have to be worried all the time about, did I hit a screw? What's going on? There's a lot more details. But fixing things together with epoxy can be a nice way to make them stay nice and solid.
Epoxy also has the benefits. So if you look at that table, the pieces of wood it was made out of, before epoxy existed, those are not useful for making into a table unless you want a table with a very interesting profile. But using epoxy lets you use pieces of wood that have weird voids and knots and checks and cracks. So it opens up a lot of possibility of being able to repair that stuff.
The epoxy, I will say, is going to be expensive.
That quantity of epoxy probably didn't cost $10,000 because they're selling the table for $10,000, but it cost a significant portion of their materials.
I would
building that table.
North of $1,000 for sure, just for that epoxy. That's a great question. And most epoxies, it's totally fine and they don't emit fumes. Julia, you are our epoxy expert. Any other thoughts on that? Saying that the fumes are going to be not as bad on woodworking epoxy, but 2-part epoxy is going to give off more fumes. If it's stinky, it's going to have a lot of smell for a short period of time. Then it's probably good to open a window. But if it's 2-part woodworking epoxy that is like a week to set, then it's fine. Just let it do its thing. So shouldn't be a problem if you're using epoxy for long setting things. just trying to translate. Also, the 48-hour table is sort of the drying surface. So if you have epoxy that you're using in your project, you set your project up like just like you would if you were gluing it. You leave it in clamps, you set it out to dry, maybe cover it in a tent so it doesn't get dusty. And then that you would just set on the 48-hour table and you can let it cure there the whole time. So trying to make sure that people at home can hear what's going on. So hope that worked for everybody. So she's saying basically our amount of epoxies in here are pretty much all safe. The thing that's on screen, that's a lot of epoxy. And there it's like a week of set time. So most of the epoxy I've used is like 24 to 48 hours for cure time. And that is sort of the sweet spot of what's going on. The longer it takes to cure, the more likely it is to lose its bubbles and to level itself on its own, which is really nice. But we try and keep our epoxy cure times here because of the shared space a little bit lower. So, try and do epoxies that cure in 2 days, 3 days. And then, like I said, leave them on the 48-hour table or the drying table and just label them for when you're going to be back. That ought to be good. Also, it's a good form to leave a message on Slack if you're going to leave something that's there and glued on, or there that's epoxy on the table. Oh yeah. And she's warning extra a lot about the dust that's in the room. It will settle into the epoxy and it will be there for forever. Yeah. Yeah, but there's always dust in the air. So be careful when you're doing epoxy. Make a little tent to put over the epoxy. A little tent for over the epoxy is really good. All right, we good? Great. I was translating a little bit for the people hearing through the microphone. So that's what I was yammering on about. Great. And so we're on to the last bit, finishing. Most projects will need some sort of final dressing, and so we're going to go over that here. There's sanding, planing, card scraping, wood stains, finishes, and paint. These are all interesting things to think about with your projects. And so first up is sanding. Sandpaper is a marvelous thing. Sand is quartz. Quartz is a crystal. That crystal is a surprisingly, shockingly hard material. And those little teeny tiny crystals of the sandpaper, they just scrape right through wood. They break up their fibers and they soften them down. In general, for sandpaper, you're going to start with the lowest numbers and you work your way to higher and higher numbers. Looking at this image that's here on the screen, your biggest grains of sand, that's your lowest grit. So this might be a 40 grit sandpaper, and then a 60 or an 80, and then 100, 120, 220, 320, something like that. Just looking at these. Sand is incredibly, unbelievably hard. And what it's doing is just tearing away at those little straws that are the wood fibers. And each time you go up an amount of sandpaper, your goal is just to remove the scratches made by the previous sandpaper. And so you want to try and go higher and higher. And really there's a cutoff for woodworking projects, I would say. In general, the highest you go to on average is 200 something, 300 something. Cool. So if there's a film, a thickness, you can stop earlier. It's great. Planers and scrapers. And so a plane like this, if we didn't have the power planer that we have in the wood shop, this is how it used to be done. They come in various different lengths. And this is just like putty knives for drywall, everyone's favorite Saturday activity. The bigger the drywall knife, the smoother the drywall you're going to get. And so the longer the planer, the bigger, smoother surface you're going to have. And so a big long one like that is to make large, smooth surfaces. The short ones are a little bit more nimble and you can sort of handle a curve or a gentle movement a little bit better. Also, they're cheaper. So, there's that. They do need to have a flat surface. These are antique tools. I have some from my great grandfather that are still perfectly fine. And so I don't use them, to be clear, but they totally could be used if I felt like doing that. And I just think they're neat showpieces. So, that's a whole thing. And then we've got a card scraper, which is a really cool thing. It looks like just a square of metal. But Adam, if you'd like to try and demonstrate, it's got, instead of being just a flat cut square, there's a little ridge, a little curl, screwed onto the edge. And so it's kind of hard to use. You need to have it up against something. And basically you scrape that across the surface, and that little hook on the edge of the metal card pulls up some of the wood. And instead of sanding, you get like scrapes or chips that come off instead of dust that goes everywhere. So people very much prefer, this one seems to be a little dusty today. It needs sharpened a bit more. But sometimes you get just chips that come off, or little rolls that come off. And so people tend to prefer them because you don't get dust everywhere. Same thing actually for planers. The planes like the big one there on the table or the one on screen. Those also, if they're sharpened properly, they'll give you the beautiful little wood curls that are really fun to see. And they're neat. But the more important part is that that's not sawdust that's making the thing flat. It's a chip. And so if you're in, not so much here where there's sawdust everywhere all the time, but if you're at home and you want to avoid having a dusty shop, you may elect to do a plane, because then you're not putting sawdust into the air. So that's a thing that you could think about if you're going to be trying to make things smooth and running epoxy pours and you want no dust in the air. Using a plane could be a way to avoid it. Yeah, no, the card scrapers, I usually find that I forget about them and then I'm sad that I did. That's how it often goes, but they're not as consumable. Like sandpaper, you have a cost to each piece of sandpaper you use. It costs, a couple of cents. It's not like they're expensive for sandpaper, but the card scraper is reusable fundamentally. So it's nice in that regard that you can just keep using it again and again and again. Absolutely. Yeah, it's totally like it's a very much honoring old traditions to use a card scraper. Feels like it. Okay. Final coatings. So coatings that you might want to put onto pieces of wood. In my head, there's finishes, stains, and paints or top covers. And that feels right. Yeah, you look these over. A finish will soak into the wood and really pop the color. So like a walnut finish may take a piece of wood and make it look a finish like an oil is going to make the colors that a wood has look really nice. There's a lot of videos of satisfying things happening on the internet. And one of them that comes around regularly is you have a nice thing that you've made out of wood and it's smooth and ready to go, but it's not ready to ship out. And then you cover it in beeswax and oil. When my wife and I made a whole bunch of cutting boards last Christmas as holiday presents for family, she was very clear that she wanted to put the oil on every single time because it's fun. It's like unwrapping a present, but kind of in the opposite direction. It's a lot of fun to have that last finishing piece. And we have a bunch of finishes here. You may have opinions about which ones you want to use. If you have done a ton of research and are absolutely, I'm only going to use Rubio Monocoat only ever. Cool. But there's a lot of good options out there. And we have a bunch in-house that are just sort of like leftovers. And if you're making something small, would totally encourage you to start with those. Right. Yeah. So some finishes are toxic and others are totally fine. Stains are another common piece. You've probably seen a yellow, what's the brand? Minwax? A yellow can of stain, like walnut stain and oak stain. You've walked by that aisle in a big box store before, where there's a whole bunch, not next to the paint somewhere, there's all these wood stains. They're probably in yellow cans. I forget the brand. Minwax is one of those brands. Yeah, coffee colors, aged barn, different like things that you might see, different whites or like grayed wood, or there's all sorts of stains that you might apply, and they can look really great. I've stained a parquet floor in a house, and it came out really nice to have a gray stained floor. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use stains. Some people love the look that they give. Others have very strong opinions about you only leave wood a natural color. And that's, again, people are just people love to have opinions, right? Every message board member will have a different feeling about it. And so take it for what you will. If you like it, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. Paints and top covers. Paints will sit on top of the wood. There's lots of top cover items that sit on the wood and don't penetrate. Finishes and stains both go in. The like polyurethane and those sorts of things sit on top of the wood. They don't go into the wood. A varnish sits on top of the wood. Very thin layers, but on top. And so those things can sit on top. Sometimes they have a strong color. Sometimes they kind of don't. But those are all, that's an entire category of things that you can put in your wood or on your wood. It's true. You definitely, I have a coffee table at home that I need to refinish, but you set a wet glass on it and you're going to have a ring for a week and a half. Others, but a bar top at a restaurant or at a bar needs to be totally fine with that without a problem. An epoxy can be a great way to do that. You can even sink pennies or bottle caps or whatever in that. And it can be cool looks. You can do all sorts of fun things with that. But those are coatings. And then sort of adjacent to all of this is the wild world of plywood, which is its own whole category of thing. If we've been talking about wood this whole time, plywood is a manufactured wood material, sort of like American cheese is a cheese food. So plywood falls into that camp. You can see over here, we've got, this looks like Baltic birch ply just because of the number of layers. And there's a lot of things to know about it. These are some common types of plywood you may run into. Baltic birch is the like chef's kiss plywood. It's the best, nicest one. It's also very expensive. Baltic birch plywood, we have some for sale in the back. It's going to have 7 to 13 layers, a lot of layers. Those layers are very thin. This is what it looks like. It's got very little amounts of voids inside. It's very consistent. If you cut through it, you know what you're expecting. The color is very same all the way through. People love it because it looks really good. Even the side looks good. Yep. And so they keep each other from moving. So you can assume a piece of plywood, all of those seasonal wood movement things that we said could be a problem. They're just not with plywood. Plywood stays the same size and shape that it has been all the time, and it always will be. Other ones that you might run into, sandy ply. This is Home Depot and Lowe's. They sell sandy ply. It is the cheaper of the plywoods that's available for sale there. I've bought a lot of sandy ply in life. It usually has 5 layers, 3 internal thick veneers that are about 1/8 of an inch thick, or maybe a little bit more, and then 2 paper thin surface veneers that are just the top layer and the bottom layer that make it look nice, and look kind of nice, but they're so thin that sometimes you cut through them with a saw and they peel up like a bad surface coating. They peel like a nasty sunburn. The sandy ply coatings make me really not like sandy ply, but it's by far the most cost effective of these. Cabinet grade or walnut plywood is basically the same thing as sandy ply. Cabinet grade plywood looks a little nicer. When they sell, it costs more at the big box stores. That's because the veneers that they put on the outer surfaces are of higher quality. Not that they are thicker, which would be the ideal higher quality, just they look better. There's less places where they had to replace where there was a knot with like a filler. They just look more like a consistent piece of wood, only upping the appearance for the cabinet grade, not really any of the mechanical features. Sheathing is another thing that you'll run into if you're walking down the plywood aisle at a big box store. Sheathing is the stuff that has blue stripes spray painted on the sides. Those blue stripes tell you how thick it is. Sheathing is not meant to look good. It is not meant to be a fine piece of furniture. It's meant to be internal. It's what goes up on the side of a house that you put siding over. So it's just there to make a solid surface. It can be what you lay down as a subfloor. It will probably have voids. It will probably look ugly, but it's really, really cheap. If you're trying to get just something that's cheap and structural, sheathing is what you want. And then veneer ratings. So if you pay extra close attention to your plywood, you'll see that it's got different ratings, A, B, C, and D. Usually a piece of plywood will have two ratings. So you may see A, B plywood or B, C plywood. Those are telling you how good it looks. An A piece of plywood, that side, the A side of the piece of plywood will be perfect with no holes or anything that was filled in. A B will have one or two places where there was a knot and they covered it up. A C, they may or may not, they either have a lot of things that were covered or maybe they didn't cover one or two of them. And a D, it just kind of looks crappy. Most of the time, a sheet of plywood will have a good side and a bad side. So when you're looking at the sheets, it's good to think about which is the good side, which is the bad side, and how do you want to have them facing. So think about that as you're making stuff. Internal voids are annoying. It's just a spot in the inner layers where there's just nothing. It's usually fine on like sandy ply where there's 3 layers. If it's the inner side, if it's the top or bottom, it's kind of frustrating. Yeah.
We have a question from the internet.
Sounds great.
What if charring is it?
Oh, charring the wood is great. That's Hugo. What's that? Oh, yeah. No, you're good. Kuroshi. Yeah, it's a word that I wish I knew how to pronounce effectively. But that's a really cool process where you can totally use a torch and just spray over a piece of wood. It's usually not relevant for plywood, but for like a pine where you have very different hardnesses and layers, it can look really cool. It's also a thing. I think if I were going to do that to a piece, and I'm thinking about doing it to a piece for my bar cart that I'm trying to make slowly, I would do that first and then apply like the protective finishes, like do that. And then you do polyurethane on top of it to sort of lock it into place. That's a really cool, I'll put a video of that into Slack. It's a really cool process. We have one of those torches, right?
I'm sure we do. That would be one thing you would definitely do in the courtyard.
Yeah, do it outside. It's a big torch. You're pointing at a piece of wood. Do it outside.
And it is, I think traditionally it's a finishing process. So by charring the outside, wood is organic material. So when you just leave it sitting outside, it gets wet, bugs get in, tiny microorganism bugs get in and make it fall apart. By burning the outside, you're just turning it into carbon, so it becomes a layer that's going to be kind of protect the wood inside from rot over time. I think it's just
charring.
time. Now there's the wrong end a little bit. I've never done it, but it is just using a torch to finish the outside and
Yeah.
the top. Which will probably be good for an inside piece.
Sure.
We don't want
Yeah. No,
everything around.
I'm totally just talking from YouTube videos I've watched, which is that much validation. So please grain of salt on that one. But it is just a torch. And then most of the videos I have seen, people have covered it in something because it often comes back inside. And so you just don't want soot everywhere. But yeah, it's a great process. It looks really cool. And that's a fun one. Other non-plywood items, MDF, which we talked a little bit about. That's just the big sheet of brown. OBS, that's the wood scraps glued together. Melamine, those are the whiteboard things. Here we go. We've got some OBS. This is in front of the camera.
Okay. That is OSB.
OSB, yeah.
Strand board.
Oh yeah, look at that. I just got it straight up wrong.
Literally just chunks of wood that they throw in a chopper and then put in a giant press with a whole bunch of glue and squish it together into a material.
It goes in a lot of furniture that you might buy. This is the stuff that's inside. It's less water problematic than MDF. MDF is the trim that swells real bad when it gets wet. This stuff won't have that problem, and so it's what they put into like an armchair that you bought for a shockingly low amount of money. And so this is a common material for that. It's pretty strong. It's not very, very strong. Like I can definitely bend it by hand. But in the right orientation, it's a great way to make things work. There's a lot of modern joists, like to hold up a house, like the first floor of a house, that have a solid wood board, and then OSB in between as sort of the middle of an I-beam structure. So that's a fun one. melamine and hardboard are usually very thin, and they're like MDF with more glue. That's basically it. Sometimes with a white coating, and then boom, you have a whiteboard, and that's it. So that's what the whiteboards upstairs. They're just melamine or hardboard with a white plastic finish over top of them. If you want like a panel inside of a boat, it's fairly light. It's pretty thin. Inside of an RV, it's commonly used just because it's a thin, light material. So what is next for this week? We want to make sure that you're headed in the direction of deciding on a project. That you have gotten wood. That's going to be a struggle for people if you haven't gotten there yet. That you finalize some plans and that you make some stuff. So that's the game plan for where we're at. We also want to show you in the back the foundation shelf, just so that you know if you want to temporarily store a thing and it isn't appropriate for the drying table, we can totally put it back there. And that can be a place where things get stored. Or you may decide to split a piece of wood with somebody. You cut off your half and leave the other half there for them. There's a lot of things that we can do sort of transactionally with the foundation shelf, and it's very, very helpful, I promise. But it's also, and we're at 8:23, so we were a little long in the tooth on the conversation. Sorry about that. But we'd like to just buzz around and do a quick show and tell about things that you may have done this week. We think we're buttoned up here. Do you think we're good? Okay, great. So we want to do show and tell. However, I do want to say, for the sake of the people at home, I'm sure you've noticed the microphone has been a lot today already. Hi. And it's going to get even worse as we do show and tell. So we may, for this one instance, turn off the camera for show and tell. And those of you at home, we just hope that you have a delightful time. And we'll do show and tell with the people that are here. Most of the time when we're in the quiet room upstairs, we'll be able to do this and it won't be a problem. So for those of you who are joining us from home, thanks for playing. And we'll see you again at the same time and nearly the same place. Hey, Tyler. Hey, Mike. All right. See you guys. Cool. So I'm going to stop sharing, do some things over here. And let's just go around the room and say what things you've done this week. If you've done anything cool, and maybe you have